Greetings comrades, this is part 2 of my video on Iran. Now, since Khomeini's Islamic world revolution failed to spread as he had hoped, Iran had resigned itself to trying to curry favour with the other countries in the Middle East, funding various armed groups around the Middle East such as Hezbollah in Lebanon, certain Shia groups in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as strengthening relations with various Shia parties. It had also cozied up with countries like Nicaragua, Venezuela and China to keep its economy alive in the face of US sanctions. Interesting side note actually, concurrent to the Iran-Iraq war were the Soviet and Afghanistan war, and also the Contra-Sandinista conflict in Nicaragua, and apparently the Iranian media actually gave more attention to the conflict in Nicaragua than they did to the Mujahideen struggling against the Soviet invasion in Afghanistan. So I think it's quite interesting to see that whoever was in charge of Khomeini's media machine thought it was more important. I guess they hated Sunnis more than they disapproved of the Sandinistas or something. But even, I believe, Daniel Ortega, I think he's still president of Nicaragua, recently said that he thought that the Iranian Revolution and the Nicaraguan Revolution were like twin revolutions, which he also banned abortion recently, so he's obviously gone off his mind. Anyway, basically the US and its allies have considered Iran to be a grave threat to their security, and the Damocles sword of Western attack has hovered over Iran continuously despite a warming of relationships in the late 90s. And this warming reached its zenith during the 2001 invasion of Afghanistan, when Iran actually contributed intelligence on the Taliban forces, who they almost had a war with as well because they opposed each other, and sent special forces to assist the US and Northern Alliance in an uprising in a town called Herat. And I'll put a Wikipedia article below, you can read about that, it's quite interesting. Since then, however, relations have deteriorated steadily, Bush adding Iran to his axis of evil, which really pissed them off apparently, at a time when they were just on the verge of actually kind of working something out. Since then, there has been much talk of attacking Iran, especially from Hillary Clinton, who was one of the most vocal advocates in the US government even before she was actually in office. Aside from being accused of numerous acts of terrorism, including supporting the Taliban, which is unlikely, as one of the Taliban's aim was to exterminate all the Shia Muslims in Afghanistan, and they had a pretty good crack at that, and a plot to assassinate a Saudi diplomat, which I don't know enough about to make a comment on. Iran is accused of developing nuclear weapons illegally, possibly to attack Israel, the US, or maybe even Saudi Arabia. The Iranian government, however, claims that they wish to develop nuclear energy peacefully. Now, recent polls have shown that 90% of Iranians in many Arab countries support Iran developing nuclear energy. Now, I cannot say for sure whether or not Iran is building nuclear weapons, but given the amount of threats coming from the West towards Iran, I can understand why they would. Of course, the proliferation of nuclear weapons is extremely negative in the view of the working class and will probably destroy us all one of these days, and if it's happening in Iran, it should be opposed domestically. I'll admit that the secrecy around elements of the Iranian nuclear program does make me suspicious, but hell, Israel is generally regarded as having over 200 nukes unannounced, but hypocrisy never stopped the West from doing anything before, so why should it start now? Countries friendly to Iran, like the BRIC countries, that's Brazil, Russia, India and China, and Venezuela, Turkey and others, have been more supportive of a civilian nuclear program, perhaps in the hopes that opening up Iran to their trading will de-radicalise the country and cool the whole situation down. Maybe it will, but the US is convinced that Iran is building weapons and nothing will change their minds as far as I can see. Perhaps they've been looking for an excuse to declaw Iran. As you all know, I've always been very suspicious of anything resembling a conspiracy theory, but I do find it very interesting that it's the coincidence that NATO would happen to launch 2 wars, Iraq and Afghanistan, and 3 if you count the drone strikes in Pakistan, on 2 countries both bordering Iran, basically surrounding it. Though the Iraqi government is quite friendly of Iran from what I can understand, which is perhaps a bit of a blowback from that whole fiasco they call an invasion, which is another conflict sparked by a quest to find mythical weapons of mass destruction in an oil-rich country. So what kind of attack could we expect if the West decides to have a pop at Iran? Well, I'd be surprised if the Israelis would be dumb enough to do it, though news reports suggest that their government might be getting ready for some shit to go down. I think the US is probably scared of that happening too, so I think they'd probably prefer to do it themselves. A series of airstrikes is most likely. They did it to Saddam's Iraq before, when he had some kind of nuclear generator. The Israelis attacked it. I think it was called Operation Opera. You can look that up on Wikipedia. Possibly at the same time as airstrikes, they might attempt to ferment some kind of uprising similar to Libya. Capitalism is going through a rough time, so I think that troops on the ground would be a real last resort. Still, we cannot rule out the possibility of a ground invasion of Iran. They have the capabilities, most likely they have the will, and they probably would succeed in toppling the government if they did it. However, Iran is most certainly not Iraq. If Iran is invaded, I wouldn't expect the country to descend into civil war as happened in Iraq. The cultural diversity isn't there. The theocracy made damn sure of that. Inevitably you'll get some civil violence, but not to the scale we've seen in Iraq. I would expect resistance to an American invasion to be much more organised and determined, however. Again, Ahmadinejad and the Iranian government, it has a base of support. Definitely. I mean, they had an election and people did vote for him. But a lot of people didn't, and that's, I think the form of government there is oppressive either way. But there are democratic elements, and I believe they were subverted. I believe that the last election was fixed. But again, there's also a lot of talk that whole kind of rioting against him was all made up by the CIA or some shit. But definitely there were massive protests this year against the regime, which are crushed pretty quickly, and there is a strong opposition movement to the system in general, and there's certainly no room for reform under the current circumstances. So any civil violence would be those who side with the imperialists, who I guess we're not too fond of anyway. Those who support the government, who we're not that fond of either, and us in the middle. Now let me be clear, Marxists have absolutely no business in supporting the Islamic theocracy politically or materially. And that regime has done everything in its power to crush working class organisations and force the population to submit to clerical hegemony at all levels. Our comrades have struggled against the regime since its creation and continue to do so to this day. Now, Marxists of course recognise that Western imperialism has no good intention for the working people of Iran either, and we oppose any interference in the situation in Iran and any aggression, military, political or economic, on the part of the US and its allies. Right now there is no war in Iran apart from a few small insurgencies, some by Marxist groups, but also by a small Sunni Muslim group. I can't remember what they're called. And so our position should be full support for the opposition movement in Iran, despite its many flaws and liberal tendencies, and opposition to sanctions against the country which are hurting the working people, cutting them off from comrades in other countries, and inhibiting their ability to struggle against the regime by making it harder for them to even struggle to survive. Now, the bourgeois clerical regime must be toppled by the Iranian workers themselves, and we must support them in this and find a strategy to help prevent our own imperialist governments in our own countries from stopping them from achieving this. The Iranian government is attempting to use this nuclear question of national sovereignty and the perceived conflict with Israel to distract from the most pressing contradiction facing the Iranian workers. The bourgeois clerical regime is completely what's the word? It's the antithesis to a workers' government. Now, the democratic aspects of the government have been greatly constricted, making that process all the more difficult, and repression has greatly inhibited the ability to organise within the country. Still, a number of these groups exists, and I will be posting links to some of them for comrades to investigate. The crisis, however, has shown the weakening of the US and its allies in stature within the international sphere, with the BRIC and many other countries becoming increasingly frustrated by their military posturing against Iran. The response, of course, must be internationalist. We must illustrate to the best of our ability that the cultural and national division imposed upon the workers in the Middle East serves only to damage them. The first step is to begin by forging links between the many groups working in Iran, both against the theocracy and imperialism, with other groups struggling against similar things in the surrounding region. A good example of this is the worker communist parties. They're three sister parties in Iran, Iraq and Kurdistan, working to promote internationalism and solidarity amongst the workers in those three nations. Here in the West we can only at this point really hope to organise against military aggression by our own governments for the time being. But I would like to hear your ideas on the subject and any suggestions you might have in that kind of area. So, you know, make a video or post a comment or whatever, and we'll, you know, let's get a debate going. I'll be posting links to a few groups on the Marxist left in Iran, and I encourage comrades to check them out and explore the matter further. I'll also be posting a link to an organisation which I have friends who work for, called Hands Off the People of Iran, who, you know, again, they oppose the Iranian government, but they also impose Western intervention on that situation. So, yeah, red salutes, comrades.